Today we're going to have 3 presenters that are members of the staff, one from the groundwater project review section, and 2 individuals from the Commission's legal department. We'll be getting started now, and the first presenter will be Mike Appleby.
Thank you, Todd, and thanks everybody for joining us today. We are here to talk about the recent regulatory changes and policy changes that were approved at the September Commission meeting. We have a lot to get through today, so I'll just go ahead and get started with this. My name is Mike Appleby. I'm the supervisor for the groundwater program at the Commission. My role here is to review and oversee the review of all the groundwater withdrawal applications that are submitted to the Commission. So the webinar today is going to be about 60 minutes long. We will stick around if there are questions that last after the 60-minute point. We're expecting about 45 minutes, give or take, for the presentation, followed by about 15 minutes for the questions. As Todd mentioned, please utilize the chat box any time throughout the presentation to enter your questions, but we won't address the questions until closer to the end. This webinar is going to talk about all of the new policies and groundwater, as well as the regulation updates that were made recently. And those can be found on our website under the applications process pages. There's a link within the PDF that was sent to you earlier today that contains a link to get to those. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Jason Euler to get started on the legal portions of the presentation.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Euler. I'm General Counsel and Secretary to the Commission. So as Mike said, we have recently adopted this rulemaking. Our commissioners adopted this on September 17th at their quarterly commission meeting. There was a lengthy comment period, and there was also a comment response document for the comments we did receive that is on the Commission's website. The policies became effective the day they were adopted, September 17th. The regulations became effective October 1st, and that was essentially to give us some time to make sure we had the updates to our online applications and other instructions as in good a shape as possible for the new regs. So a little bit of background, why these changes and why now. This rulemaking we've been working on this since 2017. We knew looking at our renewal schedule that we're expecting 200 plus groundwater withdrawal renewal applications over the next 5 years. This, for us, meant we wanted to look at our regs and be proactive, especially looking at the renewal process, because with 200 plus, that is a burden on us to review and have timely reviews and interactions. We also have gotten a number of requests over the years, to constantly look at our processes and find ways where we could reduce costs for project sponsors, especially smaller and economically challenged projects. So these rules were developed with that in mind. And also our grandfathering registration window is closed, and that allows the Commission to leverage some of that program and the data we gather to make some changes to our grandfathering rules as well. So the overview of the rulemaking, we wanted a more efficient mechanism for reviewing groundwater renewals, and we essentially do this by leveraging the use of existing long-term operations data and also the new alternative hydrogeologic evaluation, which we'll go over in more detail. We wanted to more effectively deal with small and medium capacity withdrawals, which are defined later. We wanted to rely on the registration process to eliminate most of the triggers for the loss of grandfathering, and that has been an issue that has been a difficult one to navigate both for us and for projects in the past. We also wanted to build upon some successful program changes within our natural gas consumptive use ABR approval, our ABRF program, and the minor mod regulations. And so I'll start out with those. They're not, just to quickly note, they're not terribly applicable to this group on groundwater withdrawals, but we did make some definitional changes and clarifications for our approval by rule program, both for regulating consumptive use for unconventional natural gas extraction, but also for projects primarily sourced by public water supply. That's our ABRE, 80622E, the regulations under there. And so I will turn over to our Assistant Counsel, Kurt Sebastian, to cover the next 5 slides.
Thank you, Jason. Hi, folks. Welcome again. As Jason said, my name is Kurt Sebastian. I'm Assistant Counsel here at the Commission. And I'm going to refer back to a statement Jason made about trying to look forward to 200-plus groundwater withdrawal renewal applications we're expecting over the next 5 years, and lead into my first slide here, which is about notice provisions relating to those renewals. And the key takeaway from this slide is that we have eliminated the renewal property owner notices with respect to renewals, groundwater withdrawal renewal projects, that is. So I'm going to move on to some changes that were made to our minor modification process. They're listed here, and I'm not going to read through them all, but they are, we made some additions to the list of enumerated changes that would qualify under the minor modification process. You can read them there. So as an example, adjustments to the term of an approval to align the approval with a member jurisdiction approval or another docket approval by the Commission. So changes like that. Moving on, diversions from municipalities on the Basin Divide. So a diversion is a withdrawal that would move from one basin to the other. In this case, you'll see in a second, we have an example dealing with a diversion from the Susquehanna River Basin to the Delaware River Basin. So I'll leave that up there for a second and let you read a bit. The diversion of drinking water and or municipal wastewater out of or into the basin. So essentially we're talking about water crossing the Basin Divide, and we're concerned with municipalities straddling the Basin Divide, so within very close proximity of that boundary. So this is a little bit of a more complicated issue to understand verbally. We've got some graphs here and some pictures to try to illustrate the fact. So if you look at A, that will show you that in these instances, the withdrawal there coming from the neighboring basin is going to be regulated by the appropriate member jurisdiction agency, and they're going to be exempt from Commission review. That's supplier A in the member basin, in the neighboring basin, to B in the Susquehanna River Basin. On the right, so we've got water going the other way. Those are withdrawals within the Susquehanna River Basin heading to the neighboring basin. So you can see an example A there that would be on top, the shorter arrow. The withdrawal, so that's the water coming out, but not consumptive use or the diversion, is subject to Commission review and approval. So that's, again, that's the top example there. The bottom example is B, the longer arrow, moving well beyond the Basin Divide into municipality B. There, all three are going to be subject to Commission review, so the withdrawal, the consumptive use, and the diversion. All right, and that's because, so in example A, two systems very close, back and forth over the Basin Divide. That's the rationale there. Example B, we're talking about water moving further into a neighboring basin. All right, and this brings us to my final slide. Jason mentioned in his introduction our grandfathering registration program. That program has gone quite well, and it's something that we like to tout when we can. So I'll just give you a few facts here that I think are quite impressive. And those have to do with the amount of water that's been registered Initial estimates were in the range of 310 million gallons a day of total water withdrawals. And this was 15 of what were estimated to be the top 50 water users in the basin. The actual quantities ended up being 527 million gallons a day. So we ended up getting more water registered than we thought there. And that was really the goal of this program. So that program, the folks that are carrying it out are doing a great job. With respect to the regulatory changes, what they primarily focus on are triggers or methods by which grandfathering status can be lost. We've always had pathways that would cause a project sponsor to lose grandfathering status, and those have actually been expanded over the years. This rulemaking, we're happy to announce, has actually eliminated all but two. So on the right-hand column there, you'll see that those four were the ways that a project sponsor could lose grandfathering, or I'm sorry, an entity within the basin could lose grandfathering. The addition of a new source, increasing a non-grandfathered source for previously approved projects, so that is increasing an approved source, increasing a grandfathered source, or a change of ownership. The top two on the list have been eliminated, so that what you get on the final bullet on the lower right there is that the two remaining triggers are increasing a grandfathered source above the quantity in its grandfathering certificate. And then in that case, only that source, and this is critical, would come in rather than any source associated with the project. And then a change of ownership remains a trigger to lose grandfathering status. Now, again, as an example, as in the diversion slide, a lot going on there. So just imagine here, we'll give you sort of a hypothetical. We have a public water supplier A that wants to incorporate the assets of public water supplier B. Public water supplier B is totally grandfathered. In that scenario, B would lose, as a result of the transfer, the grandfathering status of any withdrawals it has, but A, as the entity incorporating and potentially adding new sources, would not. So that's a little bit of an anecdote. And with that, that's my final slide. So again, I'd like to say thanks and turn things back over to Jason.
All right, thank you, Kurt. So first I'll start, we made a change to 806-4A2, and it would have been the old Roman numeral 3. That's the regulation that requires sources for withdrawal to make an application with the commission. We eliminated the consumptive use trigger. So withdrawals associated under 100,000 gallons a day associated with the consumptive use had to also file a withdrawal application in addition to their consumptive use application. We've eliminated that requirement. So sources individually or combined that are below 100,000 gallons per day for a project that serve a regulated consumptive use do not require separate withdrawal applications. They will still require a consumptive use application, but a separate withdrawal application would not be required. Any needed review of the withdrawal could occur within the review of the consumptive use application. So that's a change that we made that will streamline things for projects in that category. I had alluded to 4 small and medium capacity sources. So we have added definitions in the rulemaking. A small capacity source is 20,000 gallons per day or less, and a medium capacity is more than 20,000 but less than 100,000 gallons per day. We added a little bit of a different pathway for small capacity sources in the reg. The first is regarding aquifer testing or alternative hydrogeologic evaluation requirements. So small capacity sources under the new 806-12J are not subject to aquifer testing or AHE requirements, absent a specific determination made by our executive director. We would expect those to be rare, but there could be in some instances a small capacity withdrawal, depending on the setting, might require some more information, but that's something that would also could be ferreted out in a pre-application review when the project comes before us. Also, we've added a new subsection to 806.23 and B7, and that provides some more focused standards for small capacity sources for those reviews that hopefully will simplify that review process given the overall size of those withdrawals. One of the major changes we made was overhauling 806.12, and these revisions are designed to encourage the use of existing data and to review projects commensurate with the level of risk posed by the withdrawal. It was labeled as constant rate aquifer testing. We've relabeled it hydrogeologic evaluation to sort of scope it out more broadly. So a hydrogeologic evaluation is required. Now that can be an aquifer test or an alternative evaluation that's set forth in the regulation. As a rule of thumb, you could say new well or increased quantity from existing wells are likely going to remain an aquifer test. Existing well, either a renewal or a grandfathered well coming in under review, likely can be accomplished under the AHE. And there can, again, it's not ironclad. There could be some examples on either way, but that's, as a general rule of thumb, would be a good way to sort of view that. Sources undergoing renewal that can provide an interpretive hydrogeologic report that documents the results of a commission-approved aquifer test or an approved waiver may meet the requirements of 806.12 for that previously approved source without necessarily going through much more of a process. The key to that is to meet with us in a pre-application meeting to see what information we have, on file and is available before, and you might not have to even go through the formal submitting of an AHE. So the alternative evaluation is a determination by commission staff, and that would be under 806.12H that I was talking about, that a prior commission test or waiver could be sufficient even without completing the AHE. Talk with us. I will note that projects that take and report daily water levels of their wells are more likely to be successful in that process. That's probably also a true statement for the AHE as well, that long-term operational data is what we're trying to leverage to simplify the process. Right. We have a new 806.12G, and this is in lieu of an aquifer test. This establishes the alternative hydrologic evaluation process. If you've been through our process and you're familiar with the aquifer test plan waiver, we're getting rid of the waiver process, and the AHE is going to be in its place. The information that we hope to get to this process will hopefully be equivalent to that obtained through an aquifer test. And we'll look at prior testing data, withdrawal setting and location, existing site-specific operational data, including water level data and withdrawal data, and any prior commission approvals or waivers of testing requirements that we have on file, and any information that you have of prior tests and commission actions. We developed an AHE policy to provide guidance in navigating this new process. And so for that, I will turn over back over to Mike Appleby to walk you through that process and the other guidance documents briefly.
Okay, thank you, Jason and Kurt, for providing that overview of the regulation changes as well as touching on a couple of the policy changes. As Jason mentioned, there's a couple of significant changes that have occurred in regulation, and we had to make some policy changes to adapt to those regulation changes as well. So the first one is the alternative hydrogeologic evaluation. I'll get into that in a fair amount of detail in a few minutes. We also updated the aquifer testing guidance, and I call that an update because it really isn't a significant change in what was there before. It looks different, but the content is fairly similar. And then we also added a pre-drill well site review policy to address a practice that we've had in place since about 2013. So I'll get started with the alternative hydrogeologic evaluation. We also are calling that the AHE. Initially, it's probably going to look very much like a repackaging of the waiver process. So it's the new look, same great taste type thing. Depending on what you feel about that original product, might decide how you feel about a repackaged AHE. But we're also looking to make some improvements to it. And you'll start to see that over time as we develop some additional forms and as you get more practice in using the guidance and working through that process. So one of the things that had come up previously with the waivers was the difficulty in working through the waiver process, at least initially. I know that there were some consultants and project sponsors that swore that they would never do another waiver ever again. But hopefully those were early on in this process, because when the original waiver process was developed in 2007, that was really before we had a lot of long-term data. We recognized at that point that many people wouldn't be able to work through the waiver process because they weren't collecting the right data. So we were actually probably pushing more towards people doing offer tests at that time. The waivers that we tended to receive then were more along the lines of, please don't make me do an offer test, which obviously didn't give us the information that we needed to work through any kind of a geologic evaluation to meet our standards. But since then, we've encouraged people to collect water level data. We've reinstituted processes that encourage that. There's requirements with new approvals to get that back into place. And those things, combined with the education, the outreach that we've been doing, pre-application meetings, have been successful in making the waiver process much more successful, to the point that the Commission is approving 90% or more of the waivers that have been submitted to us over the last 5 to 10 years. So it's a process that has gotten much better, but there was still a good bit of room for improvement. We still want to further emphasize the use of existing data to complete the hydrogeologic evaluation, because we recognize that long-term operational data in most cases is going to be better than a short-term aquifer test. That tends to give us a better picture of what's happening in the aquifer as well as the environment. And it's also much cheaper to utilize that existing data than it is to develop new data. So how is the HE and the waiver different? Well, in some ways they're very much the same, and especially initially, if you get into it today, you're going to see the AHE is essentially just a rebranded waiver. But there is a defined policy to it now, whereas before there was only about 2 paragraphs devoted to it in the previous guidance. There is more certainty provided through the regulation, so that instead of having to waive a regulation, which we were doing 90% or more of the time that has been submitted to us, there's certainty provided to it through that regulation change. We wanted to recognize that we are routinely doing this, and it's a less scary process than it may appear to be through the waiver regulation. One of the other thing that's important is that we are switching more to a qualitative risk-based evaluation. While it's better to provide numbers to it and be able to give a risk factor associated with something, that really wasn't a very practical solution for this. So we took more of a qualitative risk-based approach that's going to be very much dependent on each specific project and the circumstances associated with it. So Jason alluded to some of this. The purpose of the AHE, the objective of it, is to streamline the renewal process. We have a lot of renewals coming in, and we needed a better framework for the Commission staff to review it, but also for project sponsors to be submitting. We recognize that if we didn't change our practice, that we were going to create a tremendous backlog, and it was going to take a long time to get through the renewals that were coming in. But more importantly, it was also going to cost the projects a lot more time and effort and money associated with the renewal process. So we're trying to focus on getting projects to focus on the most important aspect of their project and what really is the most important thing to be reviewing, while making sure that our standards are still met. Provided that the AHE gets started early enough, we envision projects and their consultants to be able to identify any data gaps that may need to be filled through operational testing or monitoring instead of having to do an aquifer testing plan and complete a full aquifer test. We think that that's going to be a much cheaper approach. Provided that people plan for this, we think that there's a good opportunity to make this work. So I mentioned the principal risk factors, and this is something that is brand new to the AHE policy. And really, it incorporates the entire hydrogeologic model for a facility and boils down a couple of important risk factors that we tend to look at when we're reviewing any project. And anybody that's been through any of our training courses has probably heard someone talk about these risk factors. It's sustainability, impacts other users, and impacts the environment. Well, for the first time, we've actually provided a definition for sustainability. And in this case, what we mean by sustainability is to reliably be able to pump that well. We're not talking about any impacts that may occur to anybody else at this point. It's just the ability of the well to produce the quantity of water that's being requested. In assessing that risk factor, it's going to be important to look at historical testing data as well as historical operational data. There are some cases where prior tests were done that may not meet current standards, but they may be good enough to help assess the sustainability standard. Often when there were prior tests done, some of the other things that were overlooked were either impacts to other users or impacts to the environment. So the focus area for those is for other users, if there's people within 2,500 feet or within the 90-day area of influence that are relying on groundwater for some process, whether it's residential use or another commercial use, that impacts of those people are being assessed. And there's multiple ways of doing that. You can look at actual water level data within their wells. You can look at the results of the prior testing. You can even look at the amount of drawdown within the production well itself to see if it's likely to cause extensive drawdown in those areas. So sometimes this can be as simple as determining that there really are no other groundwater users, or it could come down to actually monitoring some people during some form of operational testing. That was a subject of the webinar series that we did earlier this year in January through March to assess some of these data gaps during the renewal process. So some of that's already available on our website if you want to go back and take a look at that again. But we'll also be talking about some of that as we go through additional trainings that we have planned for the AHE. Then with impacts to the environment, it's very much the same. We look to see what's close by and what is important regarding those. So all these things, these risk factors, the amount of effort that you put into it is going to vary depending on the site and the specifics of that project. So transitioning from the waiver to the AHE. Like I said, if you get on our website right now and look at the AHE that is currently up there, it really is just superficial changes from the waiver to the AHE. We literally replaced the word waiver with AHE. We're going to come back later on with some additional changes to it to make it more consistent with the policy. But we wanted to make sure that when the policy became effective, that we had something available for people to utilize right away. So we do plan for some additional changes that are going to happen around January. Those forms will then be available online also, and will contain some updated information that better aligns with the policy. For example, we'll have the principal risk factors better identified in Section 4 of that. There will be a couple other pieces in Sections 1 and 2 that are changed a little bit. There's actually going to be some elimination of a few things to make the form a little bit easier to work through. So a question that a lot of people are probably going to have is that they've either already submitted a waiver under the old format, or they're working on a waiver right now and expect to submit it before January. So what happens with those? We're not going to ask projects to make any updates to those. We're going to internally transition existing waivers that are in the pipeline, either that have already been submitted or already in progress. We're going to transition those to the AHE internally, and we're not going to ask for anything specific related to that transition. There may be some questions that we would have had through the waiver process anyway, and I would expect that those questions would persist throughout the AHE process as well. But it's important to realize that we're not going to ask for anything specific to the AHE for those that are in progress. So switching over to the aquifer testing plan, one of the obvious changes to the aquifer testing plan is going to be the removal of the waiver section. There wasn't a lot there, but it's superseded by the AHE policy. So the aquifer testing plan now also recognizes that the AHE exists and mentions the pre-drill well site review. There's a couple other additions that are intended to help project sponsors understand the submittal process and provide some detailed technical guidance for consultants in developing the plans. So what specifically has changed? Well, again, it's the waivers, but it's also project modifications discussions has been removed. As Jason mentioned, most modifications are most likely going to come in through aquifer testing plans, but some could come through an AHE. And the reason for that is all based on the level of data that's going to be necessary to be required to make the change. It really depends on the type of modification that's going to be done, as well as the testing that was previously done. So that's something that really needs to be done in coordination with commission staff, and I'd recommend that anybody that's going through a modification process to contact commission staff and have a pre-application meeting to talk about that. Other changes within the guidance are reorganizing it to be consistent with the online forms. It's eliminating the paper forms that were contained within it and eliminating the checklist. The policy has also been substantially reorganized. Hopefully some parts of it will be easier to work through. It'll be a little bit more organized for the monitoring section or the implementation sections so that you know a little bit better where to look for to follow certain items. One of the big changes that is in the plan, or is in the guidance that wasn't previously there, was a brief discussion about dealing with other wells that may impact the operation of the test well, such that those wells can be controlled through that process at a constant rate or maintained to be in some kind of static position, whether it's off completely or if it's just maintained at a constant rate. And the goal with that is to try to eliminate an additional variable. So what we often saw with plans that were coming in where there might be another production well within a couple hundred feet and there's going to be interference between the two, but the plan didn't address how the operation of that other well was going to be maintained throughout testing. So we would encourage people to consider how to do that as they're developing their plans, because it's a common comment that we have. So we're trying to provide some guidance on helping people get through that and avoiding that pretty common question. A new policy that's been developed is a pre-drill well site review. This is a process that's been in place since 2013, but we had never developed a policy to go along with it. We've had draft policy for some time, and we would provide pieces of that to people when they were looking to go through the pre-drill process. But this represents the first time we've actually had an approved policy for it. So pre-drill well site review is a screening level review of potential well site locations. As the name implies, it is intended to be done before a well is drilled. We found that once wells are drilled, projects have a hard time backing away from that, even if some of the issues that would be identified during the screening would come up even before doing the aquifer test. There's already too many resources that are developed and put into it to back away from it. So we want to make sure that projects are fully aware of what the roadblocks or hurdles may be that they have to overcome in developing a new source. And just to be clear, this is not a regulatory requirement. This is something that we intend to be done cooperatively with a project and a consultant during this site evaluation. As part of it, we will come out and do a field meeting, come to the site. We'll do environmental screening, look for NWI wetlands. And these are all things that the project sponsor and its consultant can do in advance, but sometimes it helps to get the commission's perspective on what an impact to, a feature nearby may cause to a project, because there may be implications to projects, and it's good to know what those are before people commit to drilling a well on a site. This is also intended to be done around the same time that projects in Pennsylvania are going through their sanitary survey or site surveys, where DEP would go out and view the site to look for contaminant issues and anything else that DEP would mention during that site evaluation. We'd like to see this done around that time, but we can do it at any time during this process. So with that essentially is the end of the technical portion of the presentation. So I would ask that if you have any questions that you haven't already entered in the chat feature, to go ahead and start doing that. And while you're entering those questions, there are a couple of follow-up slides that I'd like to mention. So the additional staff resources, you can contact any of the people that are listed on this slide if you have questions after this webinar about any of the information contained herein. But you can also contact any of the project review staff that you may be frequently working with. We're all available to try to help you get through these processes. So please don't hesitate to contact us. I've mentioned that we're planning to do a training session on the AHE. What we had hoped to do was an in-person training similar to what we did in 2016, primarily for consultants. But with the current COVID world that we're living in, trying to plan for an in-person session probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. So we're going to switch that into a webinar series similar to what we did earlier this year. We're not sure exactly how many webinars we're going to need to cover this topic. Since it was going to be an all-day class, we would probably need certainly at least 3 webinars to get through the content. We're also thinking about doing a virtual classroom event where we provide example projects and have detailed discussions with consultants regarding their projects or the examples that we're providing. And although we intend this to be mostly for consultants, anyone would be invited to attend. So this is open to everybody, project sponsors, other agencies, and consultants. And there will be some information coming out about that within the next month or two. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. Most likely this is going to start taking place in December, and we'd be looking to wrap it up sometime maybe in February timeframe. So a couple of the important items that we'd like you to take away from this. There are significant regulatory changes and policy changes, but they really are intended to reduce costs and also to reduce regulatory requirements. Kurt talked about the grandfathering triggers, and I think that is a very important topic to reemphasize at this point, because there are, the way the commission regulations were worded, we found that they inhibited some growth that we thought was warranted and was really important to be able to do. For example, some of the regionalization that is necessary. So we've eliminated a roadblock for some of that. And also with adding a source that makes it easier to add redundant sources or replacement sources for projects. We've heard over the years that some projects that have old or possibly insufficient sources wouldn't work through the new regulatory process because they may have had one or more. In some cases, it was maybe 9 or 10 sources that were grandfathered, and they didn't want to lose that grandfathered status. So we think this is a big change. This is an important change, and we're hoping that people recognize that and recognize and take an advantage of the importance of this change for adding sources and redundancy and regionalization purposes. We've also said in prior webinars and also today that we're looking for projects to meet the aquifer testing requirements once. So if you've already met the requirements of 806.12 previously, you're not going to have to go through that again. Doesn't mean that during any renewals that there's not going to be some geologic evaluation, because our standards for withdrawals are still the same. It's just there's a different process for working through that. And that's something that we will also touch on during the AHE training. But in short, it ends up being a comparison of the prior hydrogeologic evaluation with current results. So it ends up being a little bit of what the AHE does without going through the formal AHE process. And finally, we wanted to reemphasize contacting Commission staff at any time through this process. We are available through pre-application meetings, through the Public Water Supply Assistance Program meetings, to meet with people. We encourage that. We'd like to help you get involved in this process early so that you are prepared for renewals and you're collecting only the data that you need to get through that renewal process. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Todd so that he can work through any questions that we may have received.
Thanks, Mike. Before we start the Q&A, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating today and remind everyone that the recording for today's webinar will be available on our website in the next coming days. And the new and revised regulations and policies are currently available on the Commission's website, so you can go to the website and take a look at those policies and regulations. So we have a couple of questions here, and I think some of them may have already been covered at a later point in the presentation, but we'll start off with a few on notice requirements. So the first question is, with the elimination of notification of property owners, is that just for groundwater applications? So the property owner notifications are still required for any withdrawal applications that are new, major modification applications, and renewals that are requesting an increase. Where they're not required is for a withdrawal application for renewal without any increase. It's not the consumptive use applications, the aquifer test plans and aquifer test plan waivers, they've never had a property owner notification requirement. Really the elimination of that notification is only for renewals, for withdrawals, either groundwater or surface water, that are not requesting an increase. So the second question, I'll just cover this one too. Is it just property owners that we do not have to notify for renewals? Must we still notify DEP and municipalities? So the notifications to the state, being the state regulatory agency, the county planning commission, and local municipalities are still required for all applications. The third question is, does property owner notification changes affect renewal applications for existing sources not increased that were recently submitted? And it says 10/13. So the effective date of these changes is 10/1. So these recently submitted applications would follow the notification requirements that we just covered.
Yeah, this is Mike Appleby. With projects that have recently submitted, we are reviewing the draft notices and we are providing that change to projects so that they are aware of it during that draft notice review. So you should be receiving an email shortly with a draft notice review that will identify what your new notice requirements are.
Yeah, so the next question is, and I think this is one that Mike covered, aquifer test plan waivers previously submitted in early 2021, are they still going to be reviewed, correct? So maybe Mike can just kind of repeat that answer.
Yeah, we will be reviewing those. I think the ones that were submitted earlier in 2021, we will apply the AHE concepts to it, and we won't ask the project sponsors to do any additional work to update their waiver to the AHE format.
So the next question is, I completed my online groundwater application about 6 weeks ago, but did not submit it yet. I wanted to review it again before submission. Must I change anything in my application? I think Mike already covered this one after the question was asked, but at this point, we wouldn't be asking for you to change or modify that. You can hit submit under the current application, and we would follow up with any additional information just like we would on applications if we identified anything needed. Next question is, we currently have 3 projects set up on the site with a schedule of submitting waiver requests by late December 2021. Since these rules are effective October 1st, 2021, will the current projects provide us the AHE applications instead of a waiver? Mike, do you want to cover that one, Mike?
Yeah, sure. So nothing will change with the things that are already in progress. If you got those 3 started already, you can just finish them up as you've got them started, and nothing would change with that, and then we would simply apply the AHE policy to it as we're doing our review of it. So there won't be anything new with that.
Great, thanks, Mike. If there's any other questions, you can type them into the chat box while we're seeing if anybody has anything else. I just wanted to reemphasize something that Mike said, is that we strongly encourage pre-application meetings. You can reach out to any of the contacts in project review to request a pre-application meeting. It's especially important to request those with considering the new policies and regulatory changes. And we can discuss with you how any of those changes may impact the application and renewal requirements for those projects. So we find that it's very useful for both the project and the commission staff in making sure that the new requirements will be met and understood, and some of the changes may really have an impact on how you want to request renewal. So you can just send an email, request a pre-application meeting, or make a phone call, and we'll look for some availability. They can be done in person or virtually. So. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. Once again, I just want to thank everyone for participating. There will be the recording of today's webinar available on our website in the next few days. The policies and the regulations are up on our website now, so take a look. And if you have any follow-up questions after looking at these things or thinking about what was presented today, please don't hesitate to reach out to the contacts listed on the presentation, and we look forward to sharing the additional content in the next several months that Mike talked about, including a more robust explanation of the alternative hydrogeologic evaluation process. So I guess with that, we'll close the webinar. Thank you and have a nice day.